Hi, 7th grade. We are going to be talking about some percent shortcuts today. And so actually today we are not going to use any calculators. We're just going to use your brains. So when we use these percent shortcuts, this would be like figuring out percent of a number. So like if I was asking you for 50% of a number or 30% of a number, these are some of the shortcuts that you could use. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because we'll go over these in class. But first we're going to talk about what these different percents would be as fractions and decimals. So 100% as a fraction, we would start off with 100 out of 100, which is just going to equal 1 whole. The decimal would also be 1.0. So if I'm asking you for 100% of a number, it's just that number. Or you could think of it as the number multiplied by 1 whole. Oops. All right, so when we talk about 50%, 50% as a fraction would start as 50 over 100, which ends up simplifying to 1/2. And then as a decimal, it's 0.5. So when I ask you what 50% of a number is, like 50% of 8, 50% of 20, what you're doing is you're just taking half. And some people might like to think of that as dividing by 2, which is totally acceptable if that works for you. I think the word divide can be triggering for a lot of students, but if I just say take half of the number, a lot of you are able to do that in your heads without thinking too hard. And so now we're actually going to skip down. We'll skip the 30% and come back to it. We're going to talk about 25%. So 25% as a fraction is 25 out of 100, which ends up simplifying down to 1/4. And as a decimal equivalent is 0.25. So for this, we're actually going to look at how 25% compares to the 50%. And so some of you might notice that 25% is half of 50%. So if I want 25% of a number, you're going to end up taking half of a half. Some of you might also say you can divide by 4, which again, you can divide by 4. But the word divide can be triggering for some of you, or some of you, as soon as you hear divide, you start doing a long division problem in your head. Whereas if I just ask you to take half of a half, even though that sounds confusing right now, you might be able to do it faster in your head. So now we're going to talk about 10%. So 10% is a fraction, starts as 10 1/100ths and simplifies to 1/10. This is also equivalent to 0.1. And so when we're figuring out 10% of something, really what's happening is we are going to divide it by 10, but a shortcut for dividing a number by 10 is we move the decimal one place to the left. So for example, if I wanted 10% of 50, I can just move my decimal one place to the left and get 5. Once we know 10%, 10% actually opens up a whole lot of doors for us. It'll open up 20%, 30%, 40%. We could even find 50% from it if we forgot that we could just take half. Any multiple of 10%, we would be able to figure out if we know our 10%, because we're just scaling those percents up or down. We're just going to use 30% as an example. So 30% as a fraction, we have 30 1/100ths, which is equivalent to 3/10 and 0.3. So if we think about how 10% is related to 30%, if I know 10%, then I just need to find 10% and multiply it by 3. And again, even though these other values aren't on here, the same would be true for 20%. You could find 10% and multiply it by 2. 60%, find 10% and multiply it by 6. Okay. And then for 5%, we have 5 1/100ths, which is going to end up actually equaling 1/20. This is 0.05. And for this one, we're again going to look at the relationship between the 10% and 5%. So some of you might notice that 5% is half of 10%. So if you find 10% and take half, then you'll have your 5%. And then 1% is 1/100th, 0.01. And essentially what we're doing here is dividing by 100, or when you divide something by 100, you move your decimal 2 places to the left. So let's look at some of these examples. I'm actually going to skip the $100 ones because those will all come out pretty easy. Those number, because percent means per 100 and we're talking about $100, all of the percents will be equivalent to the dollar value. So we're going to look at these ones. So what's 100% of $50? Well, to figure out 100% of a number, it's just that number. So 100% of $50 would just be $50. All right. If I want to know 50% of $50, I just want to take half of 50. So what's half of 50? 25. All right. I'm going to skip down. We're going to do this 25% first and come back to the 30. So 25% is half of 50%. So 50% was $25, so half of that. And some of these you might still need to think a little bit. All right, I'm not saying that they won't all be tricky, but so that's going to be $12.50. When here we have our 10%, remember this 10% opens up a variety of other percentages for us. So 10%, we just move our decimal 1 place to the left. So 10% of 50 is going to be 5. Now that I know that, I could figure out 20%, 30%, 40%, any multiple of 10. So 30% of 50, because 10% times 3 would give me 30%. Now, if I know that 10% is 5, if I multiply that times 3, I'm going to get 15. 5% of $50. Well, 5% is half of 10%. So I know 10% is $5. If I take half of $5, I get $2.50. And then 1% of $50, I'm going to move my decimal twice to the left. So I actually end up getting 50 cents here. Small notation, just notice I still use that dollar sign, so it's 50/100ths of a dollar. We don't want to, because that decimal's there, we don't want to label it with the cent sign because even though you might think 50 cents, it's 50/100ths of a dollar. All right, so let's look at another example. 50% of $80, so half of 80 is going to be 40. And then I usually do 25% after that. So remember, 25% is half of 50%. So take half of a half. So half of 80 is 40, half of that is 20. 10% of 80, move your decimal 1 place to the left. So that's going to be $8. Now, if I wanted to find the 30%, remember 10% times 3. So 10% is 8, so 8 times 3 would be $24. If I wanted to figure out 20%, then I would take 10% times 2. So for example, 20% of $80, 10% of 80 is 8, times 2 is going to be $16. I could do 60% of 80 the same way. Find my 10%, which is 8, and then times it by 6 to give me $48. 5% of 80, this is half of 10%. So I know that 10% of 80 is 8, so half of that is 4. And 1% of 80, I'm going to move that decimal over twice and get 80 cents. So that's just a quick little recap on some percent shortcuts that are helpful I'm going to actually show you guys one more example. You can also combine some of these. So for example, if I wanted to know 15% of 80, and again, there are a variety of ways some of you guys might look at this problem. I've had kids come up with multiple different ways. If we look at the percentages that we do know how to find, we want to figure out a relationship between some of them that would help us figure out 15%. One of the most common ways is to find 10% and 5% and add them together. But some people find their 30% and take half of that. Some people find 5% and multiply it by 3. There's a couple of different ways you could do it. I usually think of 15% as 10% plus the 5%. So 10% of 80 is going to be $8. 5% of 80 is $4. And so that's going to make my 15% be $12. So again, you can use these percent shortcuts to help you find a variety of percentages. Have a great day.